It's been a long day for some people because we've been here since 9 a.m. Eastern time. And I'm very, very excited about this session, which I've waited a long time to have this. My relationship with Allister Bush and Wiremu NiaNia goes back to 2015 when Mitch Allen, who was at that time editor and owner of Left Coast Press, had a meeting with David Epston, who many of you know as a very distinguished originator of narrative therapy, and wrote me a note about a promising project that he thought I should take a look at for our book series. And that led me to the two individuals I especially want to feature in this session. And before I get to any introductions or any of the content, I promised that we would begin with a prayer. And Allister, would you lead us in that prayer?
Thank you so much, Art, and for that lovely welcome. And Wiremu, would you consider doing the karakia or prayer for us?
Hey, boy, you all right?
Okay. Well, look, it's so lovely to meet everyone, and this is a karakia, a Indigenous Māori prayer that Wiremu taught me about 20 years ago when I first started working in the Māori Mental Health Service together. And here it goes. E pā, te timatanga me te whakamutunga, te kaihanga o ngā mea katoa, manaki te mātou e tēnei rā. Ameni.
Amen.
And so this prayer talks about the Creator being the beginning and the end of all things, and just asks for, I guess, guidance and support and protection for our meeting. So, yeah, lovely to meet you all. I imagine some of you are feeling a bit tired. Here in New Zealand, it's 11 o'clock in the morning, and it feels like a great pleasure and privilege for us to be here with you all. Thank you, Art.
Thank you. And I will give just a short introduction to our featured persons. Allister Bush is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist based in Poratua, New Zealand, where he works with a Maori mental health service. In his role, he collaborates closely with Wiremu NiaNia to integrate traditional Māori hearing practices with psychiatric care. This is a unique and original partnership that exemplifies a commitment to culturally sensitive mental health services that honors Indigenous knowledge and traditions. And together, they have formed an incredible collaborative relationship that has culminated. Well, maybe I shouldn't use the word culminated because it's still very active, and who knows where it will go from here. But it has produced 2 books in our series. They've been best-selling books that have been widely read and appreciated and reviewed throughout New Zealand and in other cultures as well. And I just want to read you a brief paragraph from one of the reviews that I came across online, which very much is reflected in the latest book as well as the first book. The text is clear and crisp, at times painstakingly reflexive, forcing the reader to slow down and engage. Successive sections of chapters are written by Wiremu, Allister, the client, and others. The use of different voices in the presentation of the cases works beautifully, each adding a layer to the same story and a lens through which to view the other layers come lenses. Consolidated trust in the stories as sturdy objects for inspection, learning, and musing upon. The polyphonic format of the book also affords a cautiousness as narratives hold each other in tension, enabling certain risky possibilities to take root. That what looks like psychosis can sometimes actually be about wairua, that distressing voices and visions contain the gift of one day being able to use one's mana to help others, that what gets called schizophrenia might actually be, quote, a doorway, notice the title of the new book, that has been jammed open and everything just pours in. I think that is an incredible, insightful, and eloquent description of how I have experienced the cases in this text and the writing. And that's why I'm so pleased that Wiremu and Allister could be with us today. And I also want to give a shout out to David Epston, who helped me enormously at several different times in writing projects and led me to their doorstep. So I want to begin then by turning to Allister and asking him to talk a little bit about the origination of the relationship with Wiremu, and hopefully they'll have a little bit back and forth. And I want to talk a little bit also about the collaboration and the way they work together. Allister.
Thank you, Art. That's lovely. And one of the things that you may notice as we go on is that Wiremu will often be very happy for me to do the talking and will be happy to slip into the background. So part of my role is to invite also Wiremu to contribute, because actually it's Wiremu's perspectives that are the most interesting ones, not mine. So yeah, I'm thoroughly looking forward to this. And just to let you know, Art, is David online with us?
I don't know. I have not heard from him the last few days. So
while I'm speaking, would you mind finding some way to send him the link in case he's finding it hard to find?
Tony, is Tony here? No. Okay, yeah, I'll try to do that. I'll do it immediately.
Okay, thanks, Art. So, just to give a bit of a background, so I completed my training as a child and adolescent psychiatrist and arrived back into a service that I'd worked in before, which was the Indigenous Māori Mental Health Service based in Moderator, New Zealand, which was near Wellington, near our capital. And so this was in 2005. As it happens, I started working there on about March the 6th, 2005. So almost exactly 20 years ago. And I was very earnestly trying to be a good enough child and adolescent psychiatrist, which meant focusing on my medical practice. And even though I was interested in Māori perspectives, Indigenous Māori perspectives, I was being quite conservative and following the traditions of my profession, which means mostly not paying attention to anything about spirituality. And about a month later, Wiremu began working at our service. And Wiremu was employed as a cultural therapist. And in my role as a psychiatrist, maybe it's the same in America, but in New Zealand, psychiatry tends to be higher up the hierarchy than some other professions in the medical system. And so I was pretty much preoccupied with my own ideas about stuff. And so Wiremu I noticed how kind he was. I noticed he was very helpful with me. For example, that karakia that I did earlier was one he taught me because I asked him, look, I would really like to be able to do a karakia with families when I meet them, to try and provide a hospitable situation. And Wiremu said, well, use, here's a karakia. So I practiced that and used it with families. But for the first 2 or 3 years, we were in meetings every week together. We call them multidisciplinary team meetings, where we might have the, doctors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and Wiremu as a cultural therapist was in those meetings. But he was hardly saying anything. And I just kind of accepted that maybe possibly my point of view was more important, etc. And so it took me 2 or 3 years to realize that Wiremu was doing some interesting things, and there were families who we were finding it very difficult to engage with, who Wiremu would go and see them, and very mysteriously their attitude towards our service would change. I can think of a situation with a 14-year-old young person who was his family were being scrutinised by care and protection services, and other agencies had been involved, and there was concern that he had mental health problems, but the family were very reluctant to engage with us until my colleague, a Māori nurse, took Wiremu round to see the mum. And something happened in the context of that meeting which amazed my nursing colleague. And at the end of that session, the mums, instead of avoiding us, the mum said she would be completely fine to be involved with us. And I was quite surprised to hear this story. And so I went to Wiremu and I asked him, Wiremu, can you explain to me what happened? And Wiremu just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, I don't know what happened. And that got me interested. And so it was Wiremu's ability to engage with people that it would be hard for the rest of us to engage with, which got me interested in what he was doing. And so because he was fairly parsimonious with his descriptions of what he was doing and very modest about it, that I realized after some time that the only way I'd really be able to understand Wiremu's practice was if I was able to be in the room together with him. So I asked him if this was possible. And Wiremu was very happy for that. And so after that, I was on the lookout for young people where they had situations that were puzzling for me as a psychiatrist to understand, but might perhaps have a situation that could be understood better from a cultural point of view, from a Māori Indigenous point of view. And so I have to say that the 2 books that we've written with Arts Stewardship have, and also with the fantastic involvement of our colleague David Epston, who I hope is here with us, have focused on stories of those families that Wiremu and I saw together. And in those situations, the families gave permission for us to audio record the sessions, and we were able to go back and transcribe the audio and then think about, reflect, analyze the sequence of events in those sessions, several of which Wiremu's involvement transformed what was going on for the young people in a way that, for me as a psychiatrist, it was very hard to understand. And sometime later, I I began to realize that Wiremu was doing what he considered to be spiritual healing. And some years later, I realized that he was a Māori healer, but he never told me that. And when I asked him about that, he played it down and said, no, that's a label that would be reserved for very special people. And so I found all of this very puzzling. And so all of this was rather puzzling. But the more that I spent time working with him and saw the difference that it made for families, the more I realized that there was something very important going on, which as a profession in psychiatry, we had no language for, we had no space for thinking about. It was kind of excluded from what we would consider important. And so in the end, in January 2010, 5 years after we started working together, Wiremu, I can remember a day, Wiremu came into my office and he leaned up against the door frame and he said, and this was just a little office in the building, but he said, how about we write a book together? And I was quite perplexed by that idea because I had no idea what that would involve. And because I had no idea what that would involve, I said, all right. And it was a much huger enterprise than I would have ever realized. Art will know exactly what I'm talking about, and I imagine some of you do as well. But that's way enough from me. And so I'd like to invite you, Wiremu, to talk about, from your side, if you would be okay to talk a bit about, when we first met and what your impressions were. And I'm actually very curious to hear myself what you would say about that and why you were even interested in a collaboration with a straight medical doctor like myself. And yeah, so Wiremu, kia
Kia
koe.
ora, everybody. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Kei te mihi o te rā kia koutou. Thank you for this opportunity. Much gratitude. Just going back to that time, I think the thing that opened me up was the curiosity, because there was an interest in what I was doing, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I probably still don't. It's out of my hands. And the more curious people became, and Allister became, the more open I became. And I still don't know what I do, but we worked well. And I remember being really, really comfortable because it wasn't an environment that I was used to. I sort of lived up in the bush on the side of a mountain, and yeah, so it took a while to get used to, but I got used to it. And well, here we are. Here we are talking to you out. So,
Yes. And I'm so pleased you're here. I have, when I got the first manuscript and even again, when I got the second book manuscript, I have to confess that I had difficulty reading through it. I thought the project was absolutely fabulous, but so much of the language was unfamiliar. A lot of it was unfamiliar to me, especially the native terminology. And I felt I had to go to school to learn to translate what these terms meant to an old white guy like me, okay? And who was not part of the Māori tradition or any of that, although I had been to New Zealand once in my life. And I wondered if it might be beneficial for you to talk a little bit about three terms that I think, I mean, there's so many terms, but the terms that were helpful to me to get some understanding of mana, tapu, and Māori, those three concepts. Can you help us understand those?
Sorry, I was it again, mana, tapu,
Mana, Māori, and tapu, T-A-P-U?
Yeah.
Yeah.
tapu, yeah.
And
Māori,
Māori.
Māori. Okay, sure. Is that right, Allister? Okay, if we took the word mana, that's authority given to humans because of our connection to a divine source. So we have absolutely authority or dominion over everything that flew, that flies, that swims, and it gave us the authority to have not have to accept our circumstances if we didn't want to. Illness is part of human makeup, but we didn't have to accept, or if we thought positively about it, we'd do away with it. That's how I thought, because I'm still here after 33 years, so we can talk about that later. Tapu is, because of that connection, you are a sacred being. Tapu means sacred. There's a scripture, and I've never read the Bible, but I know there's a scripture, I think it's in Isaiah 49:16, that talks about, for I have graven you into the palm of my hand, making us sacred beings. So the word tapu, there's a lot of reasons for the word tapu, which becomes quite a restrictive space or a restrictive word. That before, back in the day, one of our elders would go and plant a wood in the sea, by the sea, and nobody would go and collect the seafood from there, and it had time to replenish, or into the forest. And as long as you saw this particular thing sticking out of the ground, nobody went there because of the unknown. So it became a restrictive sort of practice. And then they did away with the Tohunga Suppression Act in New Zealand in 1907. And now we're policing that through our doc services and MAP. Allister can explain the names. I don't know what they are. But now we're policed by something else, whereas you could just put a stick in there and nobody went there. That was the sacredness. The Māori is Māori by connection. My connection to a divine source, my connection to my mountains, to my rivers, to my people, to my family, to my environment. That was Māori, is the connection. And if it's looked up in the dictionary, it translated as life force. So my connection to my ancestors and where I came from was my life force. And that would be the same as yours. If you looked at your people and say, how did you get there? They crossed the land to give you that existence. That's your life force. You can refer back to it. And I think, again, that's a biblical thing of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. So that's very important in terms of Māori. That's what Māori is, by connection. Yeah. That's the 3 words.
Okay.
And if you
Allister,
like, I'm happy to add a clinical story to illustrate the use of those expressions, because when I was first working with Wiremu, I had no idea about the meaning of those terms, even though I was working in a Māori service. And so there was nothing in my training to help me understand that, even though my training was mostly in New Zealand. So I met up with a 17-year-old young man who had been referred to our service because he had started having experiences. And the experience that he had was that one day he was walking out of his house, on the front door of his house, on the way to school, and he got to his letterbox, and suddenly he saw a vision of a Māori man shouting at him. And all he could see was the top half of this man. And he had a facial tattoo, and he appeared very angry. And this young man was very frightened and ran back into his house. And but then he realized that he was late for school, and so he tried walking out again, and the same angry face was at the letterbox. And finally he summoned up the courage to run past and made it to school. And this continued happening to him for several days. And then his Māori language teacher at school realized that something was amiss and asked him what was going on. And when he explained, she organized for a Māori healer to come into the school to meet him. This wasn't Wiremu, this was a different Māori healer. And the Māori healer did some prayers and sprinkled some water on him, and the vision stopped. So, but he was still having panic attacks because he was still so anxious about what had happened. And he was first referred to a service related to ours where they work with young people who are having their, or suspected to be having their first episode of a psychotic illness. So maybe hearing voices or seeing visions or believing things that other people don't believe, which are considered to be psychotic thoughts. And so, but they met with him and they were pretty sure that this wasn't a psychotic illness. So he was referred to Māori Mental Health Service. And so when I met with him, he actually met Wiremu before he met me. But when I met with him, I was really curious about his situation because his experience didn't fit neatly into a normal psychiatric category like you might come across in the DSM-5, you know, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is one of the beautiful exports from the United States. So I was really puzzled about his experience because it seemed that this vision only happened by his letterbox, and it had started one day and then finished and stopped coming back when a Māori healer did a prayer and sprinkled water. And I found this whole situation very puzzling. And when I went to see Wiremu, Wiremu had already met with this young man. But when I went to see Wiremu, we ended up having a conversation, and I was trying to satisfy my curiosity about what was going on. And so I said to Wiremu, how can we understand what's going on here? And Wiremu said, well, if you want to understand this situation, then you need to understand about mana, tapu, and mauri. These three concepts that Art's raised and Wiremu's just explained. And so he said, you know, life force is something that every person has, but if we were to hold something, you know, close to us, for example, I've got a piece of pounamu, which is greenstone, which is a precious stone in Māori culture, and I wear that around my neck and I wear it close to me. Over time, that mauri will, my mauri, my life force, will get connected to the pounamu, will get connected to the greenstone. And that's significant because Wiremu said when he met with this young man and he heard the story, the first thing that he wanted to know from this young man was, what did you do? And there was nothing particularly in my psychiatric education that would lead me to ask that in relation to this situation. But Wiremu said to this young man, what did you do? And the young man, first of all, wasn't quite sure what he meant. and then was thinking about it, and then Wiremu said, I think you've picked something up. And the young man thought about it, and he said, well, a couple of weeks before this thing happened, I was walking along the road, and I found this piece of beautiful carved greenstone like this on the road, and it was so beautiful, I picked it up and put it on. And Wiremu said, that's the answer. That's why this happened. And I was very puzzled about that because I couldn't make sense of it. So Wiremu said, the ancestors of the person who owned that piece of pounamu, the person who owned the pounamu and was wearing it, their mauri, or their life force, is connected to that. And that also connects, that life force connects that pounamu to the mana, or the I guess this you can help me out with this, Wiremu, but basically the status, or the status of their ancestors. But more than that, it's kind of like an energy. The mana is also like an energy. So this pounamu is connected to the person's ancestors. And when this young man picked it up and put it on, this was like a breach of tapu, like he was doing something that many Māori people would know is a very bad idea, which is to wear someone else's ornament. And so there's a breach of tapu, and the mauri that's connected to that, greenstone, is then connects with the ancestors, and the ancestors are angry with this young man for picking it up, and they're telling him off. Now, Wiremu, would you be okay? I think I may have slightly mangled that explanation, so I'm wondering if you'd be able to have another go.
You're doing really well. You're doing really well. Well, it said that if you take something that is not yours, there is a consequence. For your actions, there is a consequence. So what happened is, when he took that piece of that taonga, when he took it, it still carried that, the person who owned it still carried their mauri. They were still connected to it. So when he put it against his skin, he had no right to do that. So there was a consequence where the ancestors came to tell him off to, give it back. And so I hope that's helped you out to carry on with the story.
Thank you. So Wiremu then set about working with this young man to help him understand these concepts, in order that he might have the knowledge to look after himself in the future. He very quickly came to the conclusion that he was never going to pick up someone else's greenstone again and put it on. And his panic attack settled down when he understood that there was a logical cultural explanation here to help him understand what had happened. And that's what I've noticed that Wiremu has done with a lot of young people we've met together, is he's able to explain to them cultural concepts that help them understand how they might live their life in relation to their Māori culture. And yeah, so I'm grateful to you, Art, for asking Wiremu to explain those concepts, because these were totally new concepts to me when we were having this conversation, and it was quite hard for me to fathom initially. And in the writing of this, because this is a story that's included in our first book, and in the writing of that story, which we had a lot of input from our colleague David Epston, who is has always been a very skilled writer. One of the things he encouraged us to do was to write narratives and to try and get as much detail as possible including about the, I guess, the most emotional moments in the sessions with Wiremu. And as a psychiatrist, I'd been trained to write, you know, so-called objectively, which of course we all know is a load of rubbish. But the idea would be that the more emotion that was in that part of the session, the less we'd write about it. And David said to me, that's exactly the bit in the session that we need to have more detail about, and there needs to be a description of the in the narrative that brings that to life. And I found that very difficult. And you know, Wiremu and I would have long conversations. So most of the narratives have been, and the explanations from Wiremu have been written through lots of conversations that Wiremu and I have had together, which we've audio recorded and then transcribed some of Wiremu's kōrero, and then I would type some of it out, and then we would send it to David, and David would say, well, this is good, but what about this bit, or what about that bit, and had great questions for us. And so this is a little bit about how the narratives evolved. And then at some stage, we had a story, one of the very early stories that we were writing, and we'd got to a certain point, and with the text, David, you know, lots of input from Wiremu, and then David had helped us elaborate. And then we went to the mother of one of the young people, and I read this to her, and then she had a read of it, and then she said, well, this is what I think. And I turned on the tape recorder, and she had a lot to say about it. And we realized that we absolutely needed to include the stories from the family members themselves. And so each of the stories of a young person's situation and their encounter with Wiremu, and, you know, includes what I thought as a psychiatrist, what Wiremu thought as a Māori healer, and then in the story you get to find out how the situation resolved as a result of Wiremu's Māori healing intervention, and then the family reflect on what that was like for them. And sometimes it's the young person, most often the young person. So for example, the story that I just told you about, Caleb, who is the pseudonym for the young person in that story, the final part of the chapter is Caleb telling his story about his experience of the whole thing and meeting Wiremu, and then what it was like and how that made a difference in his life. So I think this is significant because even though we were being you were our series editor, Art, I didn't really understand a whole lot about autoethnography, but I think because of David's guidance and your support, we've really tried to get to the essence of the different perspectives and the narratives relating to especially the young person and the families that we were working with. And so I guess that's made me get quite interested in autoethnography and everything that that I imagine everyone here is pretty focused on. I'm wondering if you want to comment, Wiremu, on I guess the stories and the style that were used.
Well, I will comment on one thing that I remember explaining to you, because you wanted to know how we arrived at the fact that the pounamu was the thing that was causing his problem. And I remember saying to you, it's like a spiritual germ that, you know, just to make it easier to understand. And I think in a lot of cases where young people don't realize the thing about violation of sacredness or the violation of tapu, there's a consequence for that. And so it's just like picking up a spiritual germ. That if it's not resolved right then, if there's been no reparation or restoration, then what happens is, according to text, that the offences committed by the forefathers shall fall and visit upon the generations below. And so that's absolutely the truth, because the consequence of somebody's offence back in the generations, if it hasn't been resolved, whether through DNA or whatever, comes down to visit upon the generations below. And sometimes it's not even their own thing, it belongs to the people that they've gone. Now, relating to the stories, I really enjoy sitting down and listening to the questions that's asked of them, and I also am interested in how they feel or what they're going through. Because I might as well just say this now, because I've got this thing about the altering of the mind. Is that right? You talk about that? Yeah. When a person's alters their mind, because it's said that the Creator breathed into our nostrils and we became living beings with the ability to have premonition, intuition, discernment, how to build stuff and how to make choices, wise ones, hopefully. And so that for me is the part that if they alter the mind, what happens is it opens a doorway to the spiritual realm, and then these things can come through to start influence the way they behave. And so we work very carefully with that in mind, and talking to people who smoke drugs and all that, to say, hey, this is what's happening. You open you alter your mind, it opens a doorway. Suddenly you're not in charge of what goes on around you in terms of hearing voices or seeing things. Yeah, sorry, I just went overboard a bit.
No, that's great. And so one of the things I found really interesting about Wiremu's metaphor about a spiritual germ was that he was using a medical metaphor to explain spirituality to a doctor. It was weeks later that I realized what he was doing. And that's been one of the things that I've found about Wiremu's style, is that he'll use whatever metaphors are appropriate for the recipient. So fairly frequently with Māori families who are fairly often practicing Christians, for example, he'll use biblical metaphors. When he's speaking to a doctor, he uses a medical metaphor, and he uses many other kinds of metaphors in different settings. And it's interesting, the name of our second book, Ngā Kūaha, as Art was alluding to. Kūaha is a Māori word meaning doorway.
Well, yeah.
And when Wiremu was coming up with a title for our second book, which was all about, how do we understand experiences like voices and visions in psychiatry, and how do we understand those experiences from a Māori healing point of view, which are obviously very different understandings. Wiremu felt that this idea about doorways was a metaphor that could hold our book together. And in particular, Wiremu uses that metaphor quite a lot, and I've noticed he uses it quite a lot. One of the interesting things in working with teenagers and mental health is that there are really a lot of teenagers who smoke marijuana and then get unwell and end up in the psychiatric unit in our local area. And often they're quite a lot of Māori teenagers as well. And what Wiremu explained to them was, if you're tuned into spiritual things, if you're already tuned into that as a young person, when you smoke marijuana, you're altering your mind, just like Wiremu was saying before, and there's a possibility that you will wedge your doorway open and you won't be able to get the doorway closed very easily. So if you're tuned into spiritual things already, you need to take more care with those things. And that's what Wiremu's just explained about the doorway and wedging the doorway open. And what I noticed with the young Māori, they wouldn't pay any attention if I told them that marijuana was not a good idea as a psychiatrist. But if Wiremu told them, be careful because you're already spiritually aware, and if you don't be careful with drugs, you're going to wedge that doorway open and you won't be able to be in charge of the stuff that's impinging on you anymore. And it's been very interesting. The more that I've practiced in psychiatry over the last 20 years, that metaphor I've found much more powerful with young people than any psychiatric metaphors that I've used. And we've had a fair number of young people who've actually paid attention to that. Now, Art, I'm not sure, how are we going for time and what direction should we go in now?
Well, I think I want to open it up for any comments, reactions, questions. I don't know is there another session at 6 o'clock, Carolyn? Do you know? There is? Okay. Yeah, so we have only a short period of time, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, but I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to speak quickly. Reactions, gratitudes.
Sally wants to speak.
Sally? Oh, I see Sally's hand up. Go ahead, Sally.
Hi both. Hi Allister. Hi Wiremu. You can't tell the story and then not tell us what happened to the punamu. What happened to it in the end?
I suggested that we take it somewhere and just give it back to the ancestors, or we just actually got rid of, well, not chucked it in the rubbish, but just put it aside with a bit of a prayer and let it go, and it's fine. Yeah.
I wanted to know if you found the person it belonged to.
Maybe
Ella.
just to add something to that before Ella. So I guess the logic that I noticed from Wiremu is that if there's a cultural problem, that's good because we can find a cultural solution. And so Wiremu then was able to work with this young person to find a cultural solution that resolved it, as well as him having the understanding, which meant he didn't have to have the panic attacks anymore. And the spiritual resolution meant that he was free from the problem.
Yeah.
Thanks,
And
Ella.
if we had more time, we would get deeper into this issue, which I immediately was attracted to when I first read some of your work, which was, how do we know whether it's a cultural issue or a psychological, a possible psychosis? And reading this book will turn your mind around in circles, in terms of what you might have been thinking more traditionally. That's why I highly recommend looking at that. Ella, I want to get to you before we have to close. Turn on your sound.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for the comments and the exploration of the traditional healing practice. Just to state my delight in identifying commonalities between this ancestral tradition of the Māori and the ancestral traditions of Colombia. I'm Colombian. I'm definitely not what you would call indigenous Colombian. But as I was listening to Wiremu and the preciousness of the object, I was reminded of the traditions of the Kogi and other Tairona nations, ancestral nations of Colombia that do ritual 6-month healing of the land and the ocean, visiting the ancestors' land and doing as much as they can cleansing of areas that have been abused and violated by us, by Western Colombians. And it is an amazing reminder of the fact that or things that we consider to be dead are absolutely alive, and they carry powerful energies. As one very concrete example is the Tayrona Park, which is one of the most beautiful national parks of Colombia, and probably the most beautiful, is property of the Tayrona nation. And they have managed to, an agreement with the government that the park must be closed 2 months every year for the land to breathe and to recover from the abuse of visitors. As is recognizing the rights of the land and recognizing the spiritual force of that, and recognizing that the land will get back at us if we actually don't take care of it. So I just love the profound interconnections among very different ancestral traditions that really understand us as extensions of and simply another manifestation of Earth.
Thank you, Ella. That was a profound statement. Yes. Well, we have to close so others can get to the room. And I just want to thank everybody for bearing with us. It was a little shaky there at the beginning. And I'm sorry, I don't think David got here. I'll have to contact him afterward and talk to him about it. But thank you so much, Allister and Wiremu. And we will continue the conversation. And the last thing I want to say is, in the last chapter of the book, there's a wonderful, wonderful conversation between Allister and Wiremu. And those of you who are doing collaborative work, collaborative autoethnography, would benefit greatly from reading their conversation, which is about their collaboration and about the issues of trust and respect and affection, and how that aided them in their pursuit of healing and helping others, as well as building their own very deep friendship. Thank you so much.
And just want to thank you, Art, for your wonderful support and stewardship of our projects. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Sure.
Should we just finish with a brief karakia, Wiremu?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Let's do that.
Wiremu, would you do that for us?
Okay. All right. Okay. Pauhiri paurarama tiahi roto marami roto tēnei te pau ko te pau ka eke nā te pau o ene kōrero ka mā te āriki ka mā te tauira. Ke puta ki te pae au ki te ao māram. Hui te oranga, hui te marama, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. I'll explain that. It's just about putting a stake in the ground and always referring to that when we need to remember things. We refer to that stake that we're planted in the ground to always be a reminder that things. So let there be lightning, let there be light. So always look towards that. Kia ora. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.